Do you have a child in your life who loves Greek mythology? Well, stay tuned. Ahead I'll talk with Kenny Curtis and Jillian Hughes about Greeking Out, Heroes and Olympians. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and welcome to the Kids Bookshelf. Kenny Curtis is one of the creators of National Geographic Kids' Greeking Out podcast series, which he hosts and co-writes alongside with his daughter, Jillian Hughes. They join us to talk about the second book they've written to go along with their podcast. It's Greeking Out, Heroes and Olympians. Kenny and Jillian, welcome to the Kids Bookshelf.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Well, this is the second book that's a tie-in with your podcast. So before we talk about the book itself, for those who may not be familiar with it, tell us about the podcast.
Well, the podcast is approaching our 11th season, which is coming soon. It is a production with National Geographic Kids, and it is called Greeking Out, just like the book series. And it is retellings of classic Greek myths for kids and families. We use a sort of contemporary storytelling style to essentially go through these classic myths and offer some of the great adventures of history for kids and families in a more appropriate but very fun and sometimes humorous way, so that everybody can sort of enjoy the classics and at the same time get an interest in storytelling and mythology.
So, Jillian, do you see these stories as an introduction to mythology, or is this also for someone who's very familiar with those stories?
Yeah, I think that if you're familiar with the stories, you'll definitely enjoy them. You'll recognize the characters. Some of the stories, I'm sure, will be familiar. And Greek mythology is kind of having a moment right now. It's very popular, the Percy Jackson book series. So a lot of people are already aware of the Greek mythology, like lexicon. But if you're brand new to Greek mythology, this is a great entry point as well. We really introduce all the main players. We explain some of the common themes. You've heard some of the more popular stories. So we try to make it accessible for both if you're a long-time Greek fan or if this is your first time exploring these characters. We think it'll be a good place for you.
Now, the podcast and the book are geared toward a younger audience, but do you find that you have adults that also enjoy it?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. I mean, very often media for kids is experienced by the parents, whether they want to or not. Mm-hmm. Podcasting can be different because you can put earbuds in. And I think having the trusted National Geographic Kids brand, I think makes parents maybe feel a little more comfortable about their kids listening alone. But I love the idea that these stories, particularly in the books, can be shared. The books are written in chapters. Each chapter is a fully contained story. So you have the opportunity to read one thing together or have your child read one thing to you together and experience that story at the same time. And every story is followed by a takeaway box and some interesting facts with the oracle and the fast facts in the margin. So there's a lot of content that you can consider in addition to just enjoying a good story.
And I was thinking about your book, and we've talked about the first book as well, in that you've put your own humorous spin on these stories, and it seems like that's just a continuation of a tradition with these stories, because I'm sure as you research it, you find out there are many different iterations of these stories.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it really is an honor to be a part of the cycle of these stories and to get to play around with these characters. And we really do. We try to use humor as a way to engage kids, keep them listening, kind of sometimes downplay the intensity of some of the stories. But it's also just the way we talk. We're just pretty, we're always just making really corny jokes. Yeah. So it's just sort of like the way we communicate. And I think that translates on the page.
Yeah, I think there's an authentic vibe. We really want to have the right kind of tone to this. And I think that's really important for the podcast and the book. And it's something that carries through to both, which is this conversational and accessible tone that I'm hoping the listener and the reader interprets the honesty that we're coming from. We're trying to be genuine. We try not to. Some of this material can be pretty heavy. So in the podcast, we'll run a disclaimer at the beginning of an episode if we need to. But we want to be upfront about what we're really discussing for kids. And at the same time, using a little self-deprecating humor and having the Oracle of Wi-Fi interject with some funny, silly gags, I think helps break the fourth wall if the story gets a little too intense.
And with the books, the illustrations really do that as well. Javier Espia, our illustrator, just does a fantastic job of capturing that funny, humorous vibe that we have in the book and in the podcast. And I think just straight looking at the illustrations, you kind of get the tone, and it helps, seeing funny pictures of the gods throwing up it really helps bring the levity to the situation.
Like you said, Greek mythology is having a moment right now. Kids are enjoying it. People are rediscovering it if they weren't aware of it before. Why do you think these stories are still relevant for today?
Well, I think, Percy Jackson is a perfect example of taking these characters and putting them in a contemporary world and contemporary adventures. So the characters themselves, and Jillian and I talk about this all the time, they're archetypes. They're the original Avengers. They're the original superheroes. They're the original Hades is the original Darth Vader. You can make all these comps as you want, but at the same time, I also think that the themes of trying to sort of find your place in this world and using a story to express that is really important. I think trying to figure out what's going on in the world around you was kind of how some of these stories originated thousands and thousands of years ago. But expressing the human experience through a story is kind of what I think fiction, art, literature is all about.
So for those who might have picked up the first book, where does this book take them? Well, how does this go beyond the first book?
Yeah, so this is an independent book, but it does deal with the same characters, obviously, in the Greek mythology landscape. But we try to take it a layer deeper and tell lesser known stories or include more side characters that might not be what you think of when you are imagining typical Greek mythology stories. So it's a little bit deeper, but it's the same characters, the same style, the same vibe as the first one.
Yeah, it's heroes and Olympians. So we focus a little bit more on, each story focuses a little bit more on a personality or one specific character doing one specific thing, which is always enjoyable.
I'm talking with Kenny Curtis and Jillian Hughes about Greeking Out, Heroes and Olympians, and our conversation will continue. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. Give us an example of a character maybe most people won't be aware of and their story.
Io? I think Io's an interesting character. Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories. She's an attendant in the temple of Hera and happens to be gorgeous. And so, of course, Zeus starts flirting with her because that's what Zeus does. And so Hera, of course, notices this and wants to put a stop to it. But to cover his tracks, Zeus changes Io into a cow. So this woman gets changed into a cow. He thinks Hera doesn't notice it. She does. She winds up saying, "Oh, I love this cow. I'm going to keep it as my pet." Chains it to a tree and has a giant with 100 eyes guard it so that Zeus can never get to Io again. And so it's a really interesting dynamic that goes on between Zeus and Hera, the power struggle, but it's also kind of strange and humorous at the same time.
This brings to mind some of the sections you have in the book that aren't the stories, but more informational. And one of them is about animals, and there are other topics as well. Tell us about those.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best part about working with National Geographic Kids is there is an educational nonfiction component to everything that they do. And so throughout the book, to sort of break up the stories, there will be like a spread, like you mentioned, about animals or about architecture that sort of just provide kids with the context of when these stories are being told, dig a little deeper, help them to learn something about the history of Greece, and just sort of expand like the spread about Greek animals follows the story about the creation of the horse. So it sort of goes along, and just if you're interested in that, it offers you some additional educational information.
Yeah, the idea is that these stories are explaining your experience in the world is only supported when we actually can provide facts about the real world.
Right.
In addition to the real animals, you talk about mythical creatures as well.
Yeah, a lot of strange creatures in
Yes.
this book. Oh, yeah. In fact, we're working on another book that is almost all about strange creatures, so it's kind of hard for me to get away from them right now. But yeah, there are a lot of strange beasts in
Yeah.
this one.
The Sphinx.
The Sphinx, yes, yeah. We have a great story about the Cyclops, which is one of the more classic stories in Greek mythology from the Odyssey, but it's still one of my favorite stories. And the poor Cyclops gets a raw deal in that one. Not maybe not, but you know, just don't brag. Again, don't talk smack in front of the gods. This is a pro tip for you.
Yeah.
Just if you take nothing else from this, Dan, remember that.
Well, that's the thing about the gods, as you point out. These gods are not perfect. They have lots of flaws, which makes the stories interesting.
Yes, it does. And we try to point that out as often as we can, that the gods are not always the good guys. You know, they make a lot of terrible decisions. They do a lot of questionable things. And I mean, that's the interesting thing about Greek mythology is they really make the gods flawed. They give them a full spectrum of emotions, of characteristics. And what I love about the Greeking Out books is at the end of each story, we have a takeaway box that sort of tells readers the lesson or the takeaway. And a lot of times it's just encouraging them to think critically about the stories and to really understand that the gods, just because they're powerful, are not always the good guys. And we're trying to get kids to really question why stories are being told, who they're being told by, what the purpose of the stories is, and just sort of to think critically.
Another thing that the book offers at the end is sort of an A to Z guide to the Greeks. And this is great because you offer pronunciation guidelines as well for the characters.
The pronunciation is never easy. Yeah. Sometimes we deliberately go with the Anglicization. I don't know. Just making it the more contemporary pronunciation. I think Circe, for example, that character, I think if we really wanted to go with the ancient Greek pronunciation, we would be saying Kirky or Kirky. But I think that it becomes so accepted to say it a certain way. We do that. Yes, so there's a back and forth with that. But the pronunciations are great. And the glossary.
But no.
Jillian has the glossary.
The glossary is really funny, I have to admit. It is not your typical glossary. You know, we just make a lot of jokes in there. It's a little like, I hope that when people are looking it up that they chuckle a little bit. I've always slid some jokes in there, so happy with it.
I want to come back a moment to the Oracle of Wi-Fi, because I remember when we talked last time that the Oracle has a lot of fun, especially correcting you, Kenny, when she thinks that you haven't done something right and maybe corrects pronunciations, etc. For example, and you talk about in the book, it's Heracles.
Right.
And as most people would think of it as Hercules, but it's really Heracles.
Yeah, and there is a constant back and forth. Some of that, I think, is because a lot of the scripts with the Oracle of Wi-Fi written by Jillian. So she's sort of used to keeping me on track or keeping me from going too far off the rails. But I also think it provides a balance because it creates a character for both. The storyteller becomes more of a character, and then the Oracle of Wi-Fi, who is correcting or course correcting the story, is also a character. But I think the great thing for critical thinking is that the kids who are listening and reading need to decide which they need to consider the point of view.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes the Oracle of Wi-Fi, particularly in the podcast, is going a little bit off the rails herself. And so we kind of get these two things back together. It's a nice dynamic. It is certainly a relationship and a character that has begun sort of writing itself in some ways, which has been really fun to explore in both the book and the podcast.
Well, speaking of dynamics, of course, there's the father-daughter dynamic, and it seems to be working really well. What would you say about that collaborative, creative effort that you have here?
Oh, it's really fun. I mean, it really is like, I mean, sometimes we just like look at each other like, are we really? Is this really happening? What is going on? People like this? So it's fun. It doesn't really feel like work at all. Like we just have a great time bouncing ideas off of each other. You know, I have heard Kenny's voice for my entire life, so I'm very familiar with how, especially with the podcast, it's important that it sounds like it's coming out of his mouth naturally. So I've really got his tone and his style and his jokes down. And then just getting to do this with the books, it's just been a great opportunity, and we've had a lot of fun, and we haven't, you know, gotten too sick of each other yet. So it's a win.
Right. Well, to learn more, the book is Greeking Out: Heroes and Olympians by Kenny Curtis and Jillian Hughes. Kenny and Jillian, thank you for talking with me today.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, if you'd like to purchase Greeking Out, Heroes and Olympians, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you've enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. Thank you for watching this edition of the Kids Bookshelf. I'm Dan Skinner. Until next time, keep sharing the gift of reading.